Perhaps nothing has made my dad think that I'm more of a communist than my love of the metric system. I'm an unabashed, unapologetic supporter of the metric system. It really is so much better. And I get a lot of pushback from students, and I really love to torture them with it. So here's your torture. Congrats. Back when we could do barroom trivia, I've always waited for this question, which is, what are the only other two countries that don't use the metric system because it's so much better than our system? Well, it turns out that one is Liberia. That's this little country right down here in Africa. The reason that they use or don't use the metric system, because if you look back in history, though, that was actually founded by freed slaves from this country. And then the other one is this brutal dictatorship known as Myanmar. I don't know what they use, but it is probably based on their ruler in some way. No pun intended, though that was pretty funny. Here is the metric system guide that I'd encourage you to use on any kind of exam or any homework. And it includes in bold all the important prefixes and then also some of the base units. So those of you guys that don't know anything about the metric system, this is just going to be a real brief intro, and I'm going to hopefully just kind of get you guys a feel for the metric system, and then in terms of how to do conversions and stuff like that, that'll be in the very next video. But what you'll notice here is there's kind of this unity right here, right? And there's dashes for everything. Well, it turns out that depending on what you're measuring, in the metric system, there is a what's called a base unit for absolutely everything in the metric system. And we're going to talk about some of those base units. Not all of them are extremely convenient to talk about, but some of them are, and probably one of the more useful ones is meter. You'll notice that this actually says kilogram and not just gram. So gram is a measure of mass. And it turns out that that's kind of the one that we'll develop an understanding of. But when scientists adopted the international system of measurement, they just kind of called the modified gram, which is called a kilogram, as the base unit. Don't let that confuse you. It still has a gram base unit, and Kelvin and second and moles, amperes, candelas, and stuff like that. We're not going to talk too much about. We might talk a little bit about moles later. The probably one that is left off of this list, which I didn't realize until just now was actually left off, is volume. Volume is left off of this list. I don't exactly know why, but it turns out that liter is kind of the accepted unit of measurement in the metric system. As chemists, we're probably more likely to talk about milliliters, so that's what the slides that I show you are going to have to do with. And then, of course, the other one, which I'm noticing is left off of this is actually quite a horrible list, you're welcome, is the fact that even though the Kelvin is written here as temperature, probably the more common way of measuring temperature, at least in our class, is going to be degrees Celsius. The good news is that 1 degree Kelvin is exactly equal to this 1 degree Celsius. It's just that you have to add 273 to it. Don't worry about that too much. So this is just kind of, like I said, an introduction to the metric system. So one of the more important things to talk about is what the heck is the role of all these prefixes. First of all, you never have to memorize these prefixes. We're going to kind of get a feel for them as we go through here. I really recommend that you kind of carry this list with you anytime you're doing any kind of homework or exam, because actually the method for converting between them that I'm going to show you is going to involve this list. And so if we start with unity here, you'll notice that we've got all these prefixes that kind of modify that base unit, right? And so if we put a deci in front of, let's say, a gram, right? And so the base unit would be gram, and then a decigram would be abbreviated as dg. That would be saying that I've modified that base unit by taking 1/10 of it, right? Or 10 to the minus 1, as you see there. A centigram is I've kind of taken that original gram and I've divided it up into 100 pieces, or 0.01. I've modified it by 0.01. And you can kind of get the feel for this as you go through this. A milligram, for instance, would be like 1,000th of a gram. And we could also go the other way if it's convenient, right? We could also call something a kilogram. That would be equal to 1,000 grams. So you can kind of see the way that that's a really useful way to kind of go through conversions. And so you can take away all that silly crap that you have to do with like remembering it's like how many inches are in a foot and how many feet are in a yard and how many yards are in a mile and all that kind of silly stuff, which is all based on these totally whacked out numbers that have their basis in like basically the number of horses' heads that you can fit into a bucket or some silliness. And so the metric system is far better because it's a lot easier to kind of convert between measurements. So let's get a feel for the metric system. In class, we always have a bunch of silly activities that I torture the class with until people really have a really good feel for this. Unfortunately, I can't torture you any more than I can just torture you over this video lecture. So I'll just kind of tell you a couple of things and show you a couple of silly videos. It takes about 2.5 centimeters to get to an inch. That's a pretty important idea to kind of have around. Most people kind of know what an inch looks like, so it turns out it's about 2.5 centimeters. Some idiot made a ruler that is a foot long or 12 inches, but we don't want to seem like idiots. So we're going to spin this thing around, and what you'll notice is that we have centimeter markings on there, so that'll give you kind of an idea of how long these lengths are. So there is about 1 inch right there, but that's about 2.5 centimeters. It's actually 2.54 centimeters. And then each one of those little bitty little lines are a millimeter. So it takes 10 millimeters to get up to 1 centimeter, 10 centimeters to get up to what's called a decimeter. And then if you put 10 of these together, then you'll get that meter or meter stick, not a yard stick. A meter stick is longer than a yard because it's better, but it's very roughly equivalent.
Did you really just call this meter stick a yardstick?
If you run a 5-kilometer race, some of you might be runners, you can know that you've run about 3 miles. How about volume? Well, it turns out that 4 liters is just about a gallon. 500 milliliters is equal to a pint glass. So the next time you go to a bar, you better order a 500 milliliter beer. You might get punched.
There's right about 500 milliliters, or I guess you could call it a pint glass if you want to die lonely and have everyone hate you.
If we want to talk about mass, 5 grams is about the mass of a nickel.
So if you put a nickel in your hand, that is right about 5 grams right there. Just to get a feel for grams as a measure of weight. So 5 grams right there.
For all you muscle heads out there, a 45-pound plate is about 20 kilograms. One of the things, if you're a weightlifter, if you put everything in kilograms, you feel like a big giant wimp. And one Sean, your teacher, is about 100 kilograms. A feel for temperature, and this is the one that I'm pretty sure I could really bother my dad with if I tell him temperatures in Celsius, because a lot of people don't really understand Celsius temperatures. And it's really, if you go north of the border, for instance, in Canada, and you see the weather report, it just takes a little while to get used to it. But once you live with it for a little while, it feels a little bit better. Couple of things: water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Boy, that seems a lot easier to remember than just random numbers in the Fahrenheit system. Room temperature is just about 20 degrees Celsius, and body temperature is right around 37 degrees Celsius.